My name is Matt Binder, and joining us now, Ian Millhiser, Senior Constitutional Policy Analyst at Center for American Progress Action Fund and editor at ThinkProgress. Thank you so much, Ian, for joining us today.
Okay, good. Let's do this.
Great. So I wanted to have you on today, Ian, because we were just talking briefly right before we went live here on the air about this. Really, what it was the story of the weekend, what was going on Bundy Ranch, and I hadn't heard about this before this past weekend, and I was trying to find information about it, and everything seemed to be reports from like conspiracy outlets or clearly biased right-wing blogs and right-wing news, quote unquote. But you ThinkProgress, you particularly, obviously, being that you're on the program, you really covered this in a way that I was able to look at, take it in, and say, all right, now I really know what's going on. So the people who heard about Bundy Ranch and was maybe searching Twitter, searching Google to find out what was going on, and they were just getting some right-wing news website or some conspiracy blog, can you tell us what is going on at Bundy Ranch that has everybody talking?
Sure. So the Bundy Ranch, it's named after the owner, Cliven Bundy. Mm-hmm. And Mr. Bundy's been illegally grazing his cattle on federal land for 20 years. And the feds have been trying to stop him from doing this for 20 years. There's actually been 3 separate court orders. The earliest one was 1998, telling him to cut it out. Uh-huh. And finally, after 2 decades of this fight, last year they went to the court again, and they got another order saying that they can physically remove his cows. They can take his cows and impound them if he doesn't remove them from federal land. And last Saturday, a week ago Saturday, they started that roundup.
I just want to, for a quick second, I just want to point out, this is public land, correct? This is not privately owned. This isn't Bundy-owned land, because that seemed to be one of the discrepancies that I constantly saw right-wing outlets saying it was his land, and literally you were among one of the few who are actually giving me that this is not his land. This is public-owned land, government-owned land.
That's correct. This is federal government land. The feds own this land. And he's given a bunch of, increasingly ridiculous reasons for why he thinks he should be allowed to do whatever he wants. He's claimed that, well, my family was here before the federal government was. He's claimed that the Constitution doesn't give the federal government power to regulate federal lands, which it absolutely does in very explicit terms. And then he's claimed, this is my favorite one, he just said, I don't recognize the United States government as even existing. So that's who we're talking about here. We're talking about someone who, refuses to admit to the legitimacy of the United States of America. And somehow, this guy became a bit of a media celebrity. He was on Sean Hannity. A lot of right-wing radio picked him up. Right-wing Twitter picked him up. And he became such a hero that you started having not just protesters, but armed militiamen make a pilgrimage out to Nevada, and some of them explicitly said they were going to provide armed support for Mr. Bundy and to help resist the federal officials that were rounding up his cows. Where this stands right now is that on Saturday, the federal government ended the roundup because they said it wasn't safe. They was afraid that there was going to be a shootout between federal rangers and these militiamen who were showing up. And I guess if that's how things are going to stand, the lesson is if you want to go rob a bank or you want to go commit some other crime, just make sure you have 80 or so angry armed Tea Partiers backing you up, and then you can do whatever you want.
Yeah, I mean, from what you're saying, so let's just get to what I saw. One of the things I saw being passed around this past weekend was this video of a protester being tasered or a police dog being unleashed a little bit, so it lunged at a protester, and without a doubt, no doubt about it, I think the government the feds could have handled this a bit differently. I mean, no doubt about it, they they should have saw what happened coming, especially when they saw all this media attention this guy was getting. But at the same time, saying that, you know, protesters obviously should be treated differently, and, you know, there was these First Amendment areas, which of course we all know from, you know, Occupy protests, we all think those are ridiculous, and no doubt about it, it could have been handled differently. But that, I think the important thing in that is to say that doesn't make this guy right, though.
Right.
And what?
Yeah, I mean, oh, good.
Oh no, you continue. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, there was definite clumsiness to, you know, certainly the way the PR was handled by the feds. You know, that video that's been going around showing the person being tased. It's worth noting that he was tased after he kicked a police dog. So, like, yeah. You know, it's been handled clumsily. You know, and that's because generally law enforcement, you know, they are trained to enforce the law, and courts are trained to issue court orders, and land managers are trained to manage land, and they aren't necessarily trained to take on Sean Hannity.
Exactly.
So there's been some clumsy, there's been some clumsy decisions by the federal government. But that said, you know, as a matter of law, this is not a difficult case. You know, this is a guy who says, I do not recognize the government of the United States. There are 3 different federal court orders saying that he has to comply with the law. I believe 8 or 9 federal judges have now said he has to comply with the law. This guy does not have a leg to stand on.
Exactly.
And you know, ultimately the question here is whether or not, if you get enough armed people, you're allowed to break whatever law you want. And if we're going to go down that road, we might as well give this guy the keys to Fort Sumner, because that's what he's asking for here.
I just wanted to point that out beforehand, because I'm sure there'll be some right-wingers or libertarians who come across this interview, and, you know, these are the same people who gleefully cheered on the treatment of Occupy protesters, or when, you know, environmentalists get arrested, and then they turn to us when this happens, and they go, oh, you enjoy this type of thing when it happens to right-wingers? You know, it's, yeah, I mean, it's just important to point out, I think. But so what I'm trying to figure out how to go at this here. What can be done with this now that the feds basically they've retreated here, and so this guy obviously is not going to get away with it. But what can I see you have a post up at ThinkProgress from this morning, actually, where you looked at a few ways that the feds can tackle this now, being that they've already retreated. They know that this guy's got enough support where these right-wing armed militia groups will show up and back him up and create this dangerous situation. So what can be done?
So yeah, I mean, I think right now the feds are waiting for folks to disperse. Their first priority is to de-escalate the situation where there's an imminent threat of violence. But once there's no longer an imminent threat, there's a number of laws that can be used to make sure that this guy spends a little time in jail. The simplest is he could just be found in contempt of court. He's been violating a court order, so a court can say, until you show compliance with our order, you're going to cool your heels in a prison cell. Barring that, if he or any of his supporters made direct threats against federal officials, a direct threat to assault them, a direct threat to kill them, that could potentially be a federal crime. There is a law, and it hasn't been used very much, but there is a law that forbids transporting a firearm for the purpose of creating a civil disturbance, or if you know that it could be used in furtherance of a civil disturbance. And so that law potentially could be used here, and the militiamen who traveled with their guns in order to back this guy up could get up to 5 years in prison. And I think it's important that some of these folks are arrested, because this is such a high-profile case. The principle that Mr. Bundy and a lot of his supporters are asserting is that federal law becomes optional if you got enough guns. And that's a really dangerous lesson for anyone to learn. You don't want anyone to think that the law is optional if you just have enough people packing heat behind you. And so I think that it's important, once the immediate crisis is over, that, you know, a lot of the folks involved in this spend some time in prison, so that we can reestablish the fact that this is a nation of laws, and you don't get to ignore the law because you have a bunch of people packing heat on your side.
Mm-hmm. So I just want to get to the, because I'm thinking about it, and obviously I myself, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners here, are not quite familiar with how these ranchers work. So it's a regular practice where ranchers would let their cattle graze on public land, and they just pay a fee?
It's fairly common. Now, in this case, because of some issues that came up with the Endangered Species Act, I believe the feds limited grazing to 150 cattle per rancher.
Uh-huh.
So he did have a limit. Now, that said, in 1994, when he had the option to renew his permit that would have allowed him to graze those cattle, he chose not to do it. And that's when these events were set in motion, where he decided he wasn't going to renew the permit he needed in order to graze his cattle. There were and then he kept grazing them on federal land. That's when the court orders started, and that was the origin of all this. So he has not made the most minimal effort to comply with the law. And and there's a certain amount, and a lot of people who've taken his side have said they don't agree with the policy that cows shouldn't be allowed on that land, and they don't agree with the reason why the cows aren't being allowed. And if that's your position, that's fine. You can lobby your congressman. You can vote for someone who supports the policies that you want. But what you don't get to do in the United States of America is show up with a bunch of firearms. That's not how things work.
We know how these groups who are obviously using this to push forward their own agenda, how they see this issue. But do you know what people in the ranching community see this? I mean, I assume they all pay their fees. Do you know what they feel about this guy feeling he's above even them?
I couldn't speak for the rancher community as a whole. I mean, I think that most of them are fine, law-abiding people, and, if there's land they need to pay a fee to graze, they recognize that it's not their property, it's someone else's property, and they respect that. I've actually been told that a lot of ranchers really like it if they're adjacent to federal land, because the grazing fees on federal land tend to be cheaper than what a private landowner would charge you. Now, that said, there is a bit of a Wild West culture where you have, these huge swaths of land where very few people live. There's very little federal presence or law enforcement presence of any kind. And what I think happened to some extent in this case is this guy just had a sense that he could get away with things because he was out there on his own.
It's interesting you bring it up about the land issue in terms of the economics of it, because I think this just is another thing that plays into this with the idea that let the free market decide, get government out of these sort of things. I mean, this story just plays into so many of the different right-wing tropes that they constantly push forward, and I think that's why they're rallying behind this so hard.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead.
No, continue, please.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly plays into their narratives about property rights, about what they view as overreaching government. They've got video of police drawing weapons, using them against these ranchers. And so, if that's your narrative, this plays into it. But, again, what this guy is asserting is he's asserting that the United States government is not a legitimate entity. He's asserting that the federal government doesn't have any power over anyone at all, and he's asserting that the proper, and his supporters at least, many of them are asserting that the proper way to resist this entity that they view as illegitimate is through force. And that is a radical position. I've been very disappointed that Fox News and a lot of conservative radio hosts and folks like that have picked this up, because while I don't normally agree with what I see on Fox, I thought that, Fox News and I agreed that the United States of America is a legitimate nation and has sovereign authority.
Well, also, this guy's a true moocher. I mean, you know how much they hate, people feeding off the government for free without getting, giving theirs. I mean, this guy's mooching off public land and not paying the fees that everyone else is paying. I mean, this should fall right into that, except for the fact that he's a flag waving, calling himself a patriot, old white guy. I mean, really. I mean, this is really what it comes down to.
Yeah, I mean, what this... Oh, go ahead.
No, please.
Yeah, I mean, what this basically comes down to is that, he wants to use land that's not his own. I mean, this is ultimately no different than if I came home one day and I found Clive and Bundy on my couch watching my TV and drinking my orange juice. He didn't get to do that.
I would argue it's even worse because he's using this land not because he doesn't have a home, not because he wants to, practice his First Amendment rights and speak out against something. He's using this land for profit.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's very much true here that he's trying to profit off of public land. And he's trying to profit off something that he doesn't own. And at least as I understand what the federal government said, he's perfectly allowed to graze at least some of his cattle on that land, but he has to pay those grazing fees. The figure that's been quoted in a lot of news reports is that he has refused to pay about $1 million worth of grazing fees. So he owes the United States taxpayers $1 million for the trespass that he's been engaged in for these last 20 years.
My co-host Michael has a quick question.
Hey Ian, I following this story and kind of thinking of like the other subtext for it is this kind of things like Waco and the Branch Davidians. Like these are the other things that it kind of echoes, and I think I agree with you that obviously some people should go to jail and this needs to be handled well, but and not to be alarmist about it, but I mean, are you concerned that there is another scenario where things actually went in that really ugly direction, where things could actually turn violent here? Or is this really more a show and a media spectacle with some terrible ideas attached to it that obviously need to be kind of shut down?
No, I mean, I think this is more than just a media spectacle. I mean, some of the folks who've been traveling out to Nevada have made explicit comparisons between this and Waco and Ruby Ridge and other incidents like that. So, I mean, there is a message that purports to be from one of the lead militia orgs that's been sending people out there that ends with this line about how, like, most people just die when it's their time, but some people have the privilege of choosing to die in the line of service.
Jesus.
Jesus. Yeah. So there's a great deal of explicit calls for militaristic violence here, and that's I think why the feds decided that their first priority was to de-escalate the situation.
Definitely.
I don't necessarily just. Yeah.
This is really like their fantasy come to life here. I mean, this is the type of moment these militia groups and right wing groups really they wait for. It's you have this what they're pushing in the media. They want you to perceive it as this old patriotic rancher who's just doing his work out in the West, and big tyrannical government comes to take everything he has. And the people need to stand up and use their Second Amendment rights. I mean, it's really everything they want in this one story, and it's amazing that they're taking it this far. And I guess we really should have saw it coming, but it's still pretty amazing.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing that I would want to emphasize is that the people who are going out there and doing this stuff to support the rancher, this is not very many people. We're talking about dozens, maybe hundreds of people. The folks in this country who believe that they have the right to take up arms and resist the federal government because they view it as illegitimate, that's not that many people.
Yeah.
What's been so shocking about this story is that you have an issue that is limited to a tiny number of very fringe individuals, and we've just sort of lived with these fringe people in our midst for our entire lives, And now you have folks like Sean Hannity, you have Dana Loesch, who's a fairly prominent right-wing commentator, you've got various radio shows, various people on Twitter, all these media figures promoting this cause that has always represented the rightmost fringe of the country. You know, the people that Rupert Murdoch would look at and go, wow, you're crazy. And that's a disturbing development. You know, we want our conservatives in this country to have some ability to discern between crazy and not crazy, and they fell down on the job here.
Ian, I want to thank you for. Oh, really quick before we close up this interview, I forgot to bring this up earlier, but you had an update in your original story about what when the situation was de-escalating, and the feds had given him back his cattle and were moving out of the area. There was just this hilarious moment where I mean the whatever this guy's thinking. Geez, to give you a sense of where this guy's mind at, the rancher Cliven Bundy. As this is all going down and he's getting his way, he demands the sheriff to disarm all National Park Service employees and bring him their firearms. I mean, really,
yeah.
this is what we're dealing with here. It's stunning.
Yeah, no, I mean, if it wasn't so dangerous, it would be hilarious.
Yeah, really. Ian Millhiser, editor for ThinkProgress and senior constitutional policy analyst at the Center for American Progress Action Fund. Thank you so much for giving us the rundown on the Bundy Ranch situation. It was great talking with you.
I enjoyed it.